Mr. Messenger.
Mr. Chairman, board members, thank you again for the opportunity to testify today. My name again is Bill Messenger, and I'm with the National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation. Now, many have already spoken and written about why disclosure of employees' personal information, email addresses, work schedules, and phone numbers to unions violates their right to personal privacy. And while that's true, today I'd like to address my comments to the problem created by these disclosures to misuse of this information by union supporters and by third parties. Information is very difficult to protect under even the best of circumstances because, of course, it can be easily copied and easily disseminated. And here the rule contemplates, at least implicitly, that this information will be disseminated by unions. In order to use it in an organizing campaign, the union naturally must share this information with its agents and potentially its supporters, including sometimes employees in the unions and the bargaining unit at issue. This information doesn't do the union any good, sitting in a closed box. They need to use it. And of course, once these individuals obtain the information, they in turn can disseminate it to others still, either intentionally or unintentionally, simply by being careless with it. And once employees' personal information is out there, it's both inevitable and foreseeable that some of those individuals will misuse it. Easy example, an individual has personal information about an employee, could use that not only to target them for union-related reasons, but simply because they have a personal grudge against that person, or perhaps to stalk a female coworker they have an unhealthy attraction on. The information, of course, can most obviously be used for identity theft purposes, which is one of the fastest-growing white-collar crimes around. And so for these reasons, the board can't simply require that citizens' private information be given to another organization and simply hope for the best that they'll take care of it. The information needs to be safeguarded. And the problem is, I don't believe that the board can effectively require that unions safeguard this information. The first question would be, how could you write regulations that impose certain protocols to make sure that this information is kept confidential and only used for its intended purpose? And then if you could craft such regulations, does the board have the legal authority to even do it? Does it have the authority to require that unions follow certain protocols for this information? Could it punish a union for not doing so? Making failure to protect information an 8B1 violation is a rather round peg, square hole type situation. And then even if you could do all those things, as a practical matter, how would the board actually enforce it to ensure that unions and their supporters safeguard this information and use it only for the intended purpose? And of course, these problems are multiplied if you're talking about not just the union, but how the individual supporters use it. You could even have jurisdictional problems, because if the supporter we're talking about isn't a direct union agent, the board might not even have any authority to do anything to that particular individual who has that information. So in short, I don't see how this agency can ensure that employees' personal information, once it's given to the union, isn't misused by others, including without the union's intent or without the union's knowledge. The only way to avoid these problems is for the board not to require that this personal information be given to unions in the first place. And for that reason and for others, the Foundation opposes the disclosure contemplated by this rule. Thank you.
How can an employer ensure that personal information is not leaked? Let's say we have a love triangle going on the plant floor that includes a confidential employee that has access to all of this information, and all of that information gets out. That happens, doesn't it?
It does happen.
Right.
But the government's not compelling that disclosure. So when one individual shares their information with another, or in this case an employer, that potential is there. And there are some laws, state laws, that can protect that, especially since employers are generally very liable for their actions. However,
but isn't the employer compelling that disclosure? The employer can require employees to provide that information for its database.
yes, but the employer is a private organization. It's a whole different ballgame when the government, the federal government, is compelling that disclosure. So now, as the government, you have a duty, I believe, to ensure that this information is safeguarded. If two private parties don't use information correctly, perhaps that is a justification for more regulation of them. But speaking to this rule today, the question is, how can this agency ensure that the information given to unions isn't so much misused by the union intentionally, but is safeguarded so it isn't misused by others? And I don't see how it can be done.
Mr. Messenger, it's kind of a question I asked before. In your view, does work contact information stand on the same footing as personal contact information. And this would be the example. Let's suppose we concluded that, in requiring the disclosure of work contact information gives rise to other problematic issues for us, like, the solicitation that may occur then on working time and other things, surveillance issues. So if we were to come out, and I'm tell everyone this is hypothetical, but if we would hypothetically come out, no forced disclosure of business contact information, the employer is only required to disclose employee contact information like email addresses if the employer happens to have it, but there's no requirement that the employer have it. We require unions, if they end up sending emails to employee personal email accounts, that they have an unsubscribed link with appropriate sanctions if either that link is missing or not given effect if or when an employee unsubscribes. That kind of approach, is that better in a material way than having forced disclosure of work-related information and personal contact information, or is that actually worse in your view for personal contact information to be in the mix?
I think from the employee's point of view, the personal information is worse. The problem with the work information, in addition to a lot of times there's a blend of, employees use work emails for personal purposes, that also brings up a whole host of employer-related issues, control over their own communication systems and IT systems and such. The personal information purely about employees, let's say Hotmail accounts, their own personal accounts, that doesn't create those problems to the employer, but from the employee's point of view, that might even be worse. Because again, that's for the employee themselves. It's no longer associated for work. So if you do have an employee who keeps a very firm line between their working world and their working email and their personal email, like for example I do, I would say it's worse if my personal email was floating out there than if you could find my work email. My work email, you can find it real easy. But that's for work. There's a reason it's out there, so people can contact me. But the personal email, I would find, a bigger violation of my privacy than disclosure of my work email.
What if there was an opt-out on the front end, like an actual opt-out as opposed to an unsubscribe? So basically people had the same choice to allow their personal email to go over, just like they had the choice upon being employed by the employer to agree to the condition of, well, you have to disclose this contact information.
Exactly. I mean, an opt-in. I'm sorry.
I'm talking about an opt-out. The employee
Yep.
gets full notice that if you do nothing, the default is this information is being turned over.
I see two problems with the opt-out. The first of which, of course, it puts the onus on the employee to do something. I don't believe the employee should have to do anything to protect their personal privacy. They should make the affirmative choice to put that out there. They shouldn't be put in a situation which, if I do nothing, something happens, because just as general human nature, the default usually happens. There's a reason, companies give rebates instead of reducing the price. A lot of people just don't send in the rebates even if they could.
Right,
And
but
then
our
second-
vote, for example, our votes in our election are based on who shows up.
Exactly.
And so if you don't act, then, you're stuck with the consequences of that.
And then the other problem with the opt-out, which I can't quite wrap my mind around, is the time frame. We're talking about, under these proposed rules, the 9th or 11th day, the information will be given out. So these employees will have a very short time frame to make the decision. And then, of course, there's the question of who provides the notice. I believe, as Chairman Pierce mentioned, having the employer doing that creates polling issues. If the employer can go around and says, who wants to opt out? And then if the agency does it, you have a speed issue. Within, when the petition is filed, the agency would have to send out by mail a notice almost instantly, to everyone involved, besides just the cost of that, of having to do that for every time an election was done. Even if they did that, the agency did that, the employees would have, 2-3 days, maybe, business days, to respond to that before the information goes out. Because once that list is given, the cat's out of the bag. You
Right.
can't take it back.
If the timing was a bit different, would you find any length of time for an employee to consider an opt-out to be acceptable?
Not acceptable, but obviously better. The longer the length of time, the better it would be, as opposed to the alternative of having no option at all. So, as opposed to worse options, that's better than not having any option to opt out at all.
Are your objections the same arguments with respect to the current Excelsior List requirements?
I believe they could be made similar objections. The identity theft issue is somewhat lower. But the true value of the current Excelsior list isn't the address and contact information. It's really finding out who is employed at a particular facility. It's not that hard to find out where somebody's address is once you know their name. But the true value of an Excelsior list to a union is now they know who the 200 people are who work at that particular facility. Without that list, they just don't even know who the person is. And so
You don't think the unions need the addresses? Is that what you're saying? You don't think the unions are
It makes
interested
life
in getting the addresses?
it probably makes life easier for the unions, but the privacy interests aren't quite as powerful as when you're talking about phone numbers and email addresses, which, as some speakers have talked about before, to go to someone's home, it's easier to shut the door. You know that someone is there. And also, quite frankly, it's easy to find. Once they have your personal telephone number and email, it's much easier to be contacted, much harder to stop it.
So would you have an objection to codifying the Excelsior requirements then?
I don't see the need for it. I mean, I believe it's been, 50 years? I don't
But
think
you wouldn't object to doing it?
Not offhand. I mean, speaking of myself, I mean, it's been there for a long time. I don't think it's going anywhere.
And the evidence of misuse with that information, do you have that for us?
There has been misuse of information, the Fisher case, which is mentioned here. Another example in our comments, this wasn't from the Excelsior list, but from other information, the Peltier case out of Connecticut, where the unions retaliated against an individual who filed a decertification petition by signing her up for every magazine known to man and just subscribing one after another, which created
woman?
huge amounts of difficulties for her.
But that wasn't an Excelsior list issue?
But it was information provided to the
information.
union. And without, the more information that the union has or the individuals have, the more it can be used for identity theft purposes and harassment purposes. So can an address be used for harassment? Yes. But an address, a telephone number, more potential. An address, telephone number, work schedule, and email, it keeps adding. And so the Excelsior list in and of itself today does contemplate it as an invasion of employees' personal privacy. But that's not a justification for saying it's not worse to require even more disclosure.
Thank you, Mr. Messenger.
Thank you.